to you about how I teach AP biology and what I consider to be most important as far as students knowing what they need to know and be able to do. I start my ABIO courses by going by starting with evolution. The College Board in their new syllabus has it going as Unit 7, but uh, at my school, we strongly believe that you need to start with evolution, and evolution frames your thinking then through every other unit of the course. So it is one of the College Board's big ideas, and it is the core theme in biology. It's defined as the descent from a common ancestor with modification. So it brings into play all the different disciplines in biology. So you get a general introduction to each discipline, but you also learn how organisms have changed over time. And you also start learning about how processes have changed over time. And you can frame everything with in terms of evolution as you make your way through the rest of the course. And it makes sense to students to have it presented that way. They understand the other topics much better when they think in terms of evolution. And when we talk about evolution, then we're going to talk about natural selection and the main mechanism that drives evolution. We talk about how the environment is the driving force behind change over time. We talk about mutations, and we talk about sexual reproduction as being important ways for evolution to take place. So we spend quite a bit of time in the first part of the course talking about evolution and doing various activities around evolution to get students to think in those terms as far as organisms changing over time. The second big idea, and where we go to next, is energy transfer. And any energy transfer is all about how energy is produced, how energy goes through different levels in an ecosystem, and what happens to energy when an organism dies. So life does not occur without energy exchanges, obviously, and we need to know that where our energy comes from. It comes from the sun, and then we need to know how it gets to living things. So we need to talk about the process of photosynthesis, and we need to talk about the process of cellular respiration. But we need to put those into context with ecosystems. So we look at energy from a whole planet kind of view, not only how it's produced and where it goes, but what happens to it with living things. And the most important mechanism behind this is this diagram right here, the carbon oxygen cycle. So students really need to be able to understand and explain in a model such as this. They need to get right into here and talk about how energy is produced and stored via photosynthesis, how these organic molecules are passed on, and then how both plants and animals are going to use this particular organelle, the mitochondria, to make energy into a form that can be used, ATP. And then they have to see that the waste products, carbon dioxide and water, recycle back. But what they also need to know is while raw materials can cycle and recycle, energy cannot, because at the end of the day, all the energy that we use or that is stored is going to be dissipated as heat. So that is an important point students need to be able to grasp as well. The third big idea that we've used to frame the course is that of continuity and change in living things. We talk about the fact that we have a common genetic code, that we have a common genetic material, that every organism that has been alive, is alive today, all have an identical genetic code. And we describe how that allows species to maintain themselves from generation to generation, but also respond to changes in their environment. So while the DNA molecule that holds our information is stable, It does have the ability to change, and this allows organisms to change and evolve. Then our fourth big idea is that of interactions and feedback. This is how organisms interact inside, how they communicate internally, but then also how they interact with the environment and with other living things. And we first talk about, within this big idea, we talk about molecular interactions. We need to know about the chemical reactions that take place in living things. We need to know that these reactions are catalyzed, that enzymes are very important biological molecules. And we have to take a deep dive into how enzymes work so students can understand this. We have to talk about the different kinds of reactions, those that build, those that break down, and then the sum total of all these chemical reactions being our metabolism. Then there are cellular interactions. We have to talk about how cells communicate intercellularly with different parts of the cell. And we also need to talk about how cells communicate with other cells, extracellular communication. We need to know about feedback mechanisms, obviously. In an introductory biology course, you are taught the word homeostasis. Meaning that you're basically going to be able to respond to changes in your environment and maintain a steady state. Well, we have to understand more deeply how feedback mechanisms work to allow us to have the ability to maintain homeostasis. Senescence is a term that biologists use to describe the natural aging process of cells and organisms and the changes that occur as living things age. And then lastly, another topic that we need to talk about is programmed cell death, which is known as apoptosis. Again, it's a natural process. It's something that is occurring every day, and it is something students really need to know about. And then the ecology point of view, as far as interactions and feedback, how organisms interact with each other, how organisms interact with different species, and how organisms interact with the environment. All very important for students to know and be able to understand. And then there are the community interactions. Certainly man versus nature and man versus the environment are things that need to be talked about. And there are environmental issues that are a part of the AP curriculum that we delve into and we need to know. So I have taken all this and come up with what I call the 10 must-know concepts of AP biology. And we start, even before we talk about evolution in my classes, we start by going through these must-know concepts. And students have to know them very well because they keep coming back over and over again as we talk about each of the topics. The first thing that students need to know about is the conformation of biological molecules. Conformation means their shape. And every biological molecule has a shape it works best at when conditions are good for the organism. And we have to talk about what happens when conformations change in biological molecules. So that is the first must know. The second is what happens when conditions change. The shape of biological molecules change, and that is called denaturation. And this is almost always not a good thing for living things to have their biological molecules denature. The simplest example being what happens to our biological molecules at high fevers. They unravel and unfold and don't work properly anymore. Which really harms the homeostasis of the living things. The next thing students need to know all about is ATP, that it is an energy transfer molecule, not an energy storage molecule. They need to know the structure of ATP. They need to know how ATP works in living things. And that's the third of my 10 must-know concepts. The fourth is describing the importance of a process called phosphorylation. Uh, High energy phosphate groups, which you find on molecules like ATP, have the ability to positively change the conformation of biological molecules. So we can see, even by the time we get to the fourth concept, we need to know about the other three concepts to begin to describe it. So we will have students understand what phosphorylation is, how it happens, and give some examples of what it does. The fifth concept is that of the central dogma of molecular biology. This is what the famous geneticist Francis Crick described as how DNA works, how RNA works, and the three processes involved: replication of the genetic material, transcription of the genetic material, and then translation of the genetic material into a protein. And Crick cautioned us that any student of biology needs to know these concepts. So certainly it is a must-know concept for us to have. Then next up, we have the next must-know concept, which is all about signal transduction pathways. This is cells having the ability to communicate with each other over long distances. And as more and more details emerge about how signal transduction pathways work, we're learning that they are one of the reasons cells become cancerous. And if we can treat the signal transduction pathways, we can treat the cancer at the same time. So that's something that is important for students to know and be able to explain. The idea of induced fit. Biological molecules do not fit together like puzzle pieces. Instead, they are much more flexible and malleable, and they can change their shapes slightly so that they fit each other best. The old way of thinking, for instance, with enzymes fitting together, was that it was like a lock and a key. However, that's much too rigid to think about. Instead, it is more of an induced fit. Another thing students need to know all about is the cell cycle, the orderly progression of events that cells go through as they make their way through their life cycle. Some cells actively divide, like your skin cells, so they go through all phases of the cell cycle in a regular order. And then we have some cells that are fated never to divide again, and they go through and stop partway through the cell cycle. But students who understand the cell cycle can also better explain diseases like cancer, in which the cell cycle goes badly. We turn our attention for our ninth must-know concept as being that of pedigrees and inheritance. Understanding how traits are inherited over time in families and the types of patterns of inheritance are very important for students to know and understand. So we spend quite a bit of time looking at pedigrees and examining them. And then lastly, the difference between good and bad mutations. The term itself, mutations, is given a connotation as being bad. And yes, most mutations are bad. But early on in the history of life on Earth, mutations were really the driving force of evolution, much more so then than they are today. So students need to know the difference between good and bad mutations, and we talk about those as well. So those are the must-know concepts. Now allow me to tell you a little bit about the AP exam itself, what students are going to find themselves. I want to emphasize here, while we know that the scores are important, we also, at least in my opinion, being able to understand these concepts makes students they increase their knowledge level and allows them to see if biology is a field that excites them. That's, to me, is more important than actually a score on the exam. But I understand that people want to do well on this exam. So I certainly will prepare students to do well. The exam itself has two parts. Each part's going to count as 50% of the grade. The parts are separate, and you are given 90 minutes to do each part. Part one is 60 multiple choice questions that cover the entire course. There are questions where you are given data sets, and then the questions come in groups. And sometimes you have 3 or 4 or 5 multiple choice questions in a group based on a particular set of data. There's a lot of reading for students to do. There are no recall kind of questions. They are all application questions and higher. And there are questions where students are going to need to do calculations, and they are given a reference table sheet as they don't need to memorize equations, and they are allowed to use a calculator on the exam. Once part one is complete, students are given a short break, and then it's on to part two. These are 6 constructed response questions, better known as short answer questions. And they're actually divided up in kind of unique ways. And I'll get into that as we move through. So let's talk a little bit about part one, a little bit more detail. You're going to be asked to read about a biology concept, or look at data, or both. And sometimes you look at multiple data sets within a study, and you're always going to have to be able to interpret the data you're given. And one thing that we focus on, that we talk about, is whether data is statistically significant or not. And that's something students need to be able to recognize and be able to do. So as I said before, there are no recall questions. You're going to take the information and knowledge that you have, and you're going to apply it to a new situation. For example, you're going to learn about how genes are expressed, and then you're going to be given a gene you've never heard of before, and you're going to see a description or data on its expression, and you're going to have to apply what you already know to that new situation and figure it out. As I said, there will be some questions that ask you to make calculations. There's an equation sheet that you'll have at your disposal, and we will work with that equation sheet as we go through the course. And as I said, there are data set questions, 3, 4, or 5 questions about the data. There is usually some description of the study as well, and it can be from any area of the course. They like to look at data from cellular respiration or photosynthesis, from ecology experiments, from evolution data, things of that nature. So part two of the exam, as I said, are 6 constructed response questions. They really want you to, they suggest that you spend a certain amount of time on each question so you can get to all of them. For questions 1 and 2, they would expect you to spend about 20 minutes per question. And then for questions 3, 4, 5, and 6, they would ask you to spend about 10 to 12 minutes per question. So 1 and 2 are both worth 10 points each. They will have descriptions and multiple data sets, and they will ask you to think not only about the results of the experiment, but also the experiment's design itself. So you're going to have to think about if the experiment was done properly or not, what changes you could make, and then go on to talk about the data. The great thing about the constructed response questions on the AP Bio exam is they boldface their descriptive terms, so you know exactly what you need to do to get the points that are offered to you. So each part within the question will be worth 1 point. Within question 1 or 2, they'll ask you to make some kind of graph. And that will be worth multiple points, obviously, and then answer questions about the graph that you make as well. So you may have a 4-point graph and then 6 questions that go after it. And that is in either question 1 or 2, but not both. You'll only be making one graph. Questions 3, 4, 5, and 6 are worth 4 points apiece. So there will be either a paragraph with a concept or description, or just one set of data on an experiment. One of the questions is going to have a graph with error bars on it. And you can pretty much count on one question talking about signal transduction, one question talking about evolution, and one question talking about ecology within these sets. So they call the part A in questions 3, 4, 5, and 6 emerging. You would need to get all the part A points just to pass the exam, which I know is not a goal for people here. So the part B question and C questions are called proficient questions. They're a bit harder, and you're going to need to get both of those right if your goal is a 4. So to break it down differently, the College Board would expect about 80% of the test takers to be able to get the part A question correct. They would expect about 50% of the test takers to get part B and C correct. And then the part D question will be harder. You're going to need to get more of these right than wrong for a 5. And these are more difficult, and the College Board will expect only about 10 to 15% of the test takers to get the part D question correct. So that's where you're going to separate yourselves from the rest of the test takers by being able to nail those part D questions. So now let me dive a little bit into honors biology, and then I'll certainly take any questions that folks have. So honors biology would be a preparatory course for students taking high school level biology for the first time. When you're done, you would be able to take the SAT-2 subject test on biology, and you would be able to do either version of it, the ecology one or the molecular biology one. So we focus first on the scientific method and data collection and analysis, the whole concept of homeostasis, the life processes living things go through, how living things are classified, biological chemistry, a tour of the cell, a tour of basic genetics, evolution, the systems in living things, and of course, ecology. And students would be very well prepared, over-prepared to take the living environment exam as well. By the time this course is over, they would get a lot more than the living environment curriculum here. There is breadth, but there is depth as well. The first semester topics, we would start with a grounding in the scientific method, how data is collected and organized, and then graphing skills and data analysis skills. Next, the life processes that living things carry out, as well as the domain system of classification, which is the most modern way to classify living things at this point. Then biological chemistry, so that students understand bonding and the nature of bonds, and then the 4 major organic compounds, as well as a look at how water is important for living things. Next up, a separate unit on enzymes, because they're important for students to know. And this allows us to go back and spiral through data collection and data analysis with enzymes. Then we take a tour of the cell with all the organelles and introducing them and how they work together for certain life processes. And then we go through the body systems and do some comparative anatomy with different things. We start with nutrition and the digestive system. Then it's transport across cell membranes, but also the human circulatory system as well. The process of cellular respiration coupled with the life process of breathing and gas exchange in living things. Excretion, the removal of metabolic waste, either through sweating or our urinary system comes next. And then locomotion, how living things move, comparative anatomy through each of those. And then that finishes the first semester. And then we continue on with life processes in the second semester. Regulation, both the nervous system and the endocrine system, and how both plants and animals regulate changes in their environment. Reproduction, comparative anatomy, and this is where also we will get into cell division, both for growth and repair and for the production of sperm and egg, as well as a look at male and female reproductive parts and the female menstrual cycle. The immune system, certainly a timely topic, and students will learn how vaccines are being produced these days, because it's much different than it was back in the last century. Mendelian genetics, simple inheritance patterns and traits, as well as then some molecular genetics, a brief look at each of the processes that cells go through. The manipulation of DNA, recombinant DNA technology, and genetic engineering, something that we look at in a good bit of detail. Then we get to evolution as a topic. And then the course finishes with ecology.